Psychology often refers to itself as a lab-based science, with the experimental method being its main approach to research. Well, that's the claim made by those who lack a bit of an understanding of the importance and prevalence of qualitative research in psychology. These days, it's becoming less common to hear psychology being described wholly as a lab-based science. But here's the thing. Qualitative research is all about experiments. And in this video, I'll tell you why. So, the claim that psychology is a lab-based science that uses experimental methods to test psychological theories is wrong. Because while some research in psychology is like that, not all research is like that. In particular, we've got qualitative research. We've got lots of it, and it's been happening in psychology for a very long time. But the history of psychology has often been written in a way that overlooks that. So we've got Wilhelm Wundt, described as one of the founding fathers of modern psychology because he opened the first psychology research laboratory at the University of Leipzig in 1879. It was a laboratory where psychological experiments were carried out using quantitative methods. And so he's also referred to as the father of experimental psychology. Yes, Wundt promoted the use of the lab-based experimental method in psychology, but he was also a cultural psychologist, and that's why he also used and promoted the qualitative research. Indeed, he believed that psychology had to combine both quantitative and qualitative methods if it was to become a successful and meaningful science. And that, up until quite recently, was commonly overlooked. I remember that when I studied psychology way back in the 1980s, there was no mention of how Wilhelm Wundt promoted the use of qualitative research. We're pretty much taught that quantitative methods was the core of psychology. And in my first lecturing job in psychology, way back in the mid to late 1990s, I remember being taken aside by a concerned senior academic who'd heard that I was encouraging psychology students to undertake qualitative research in their honours projects, which I was. I was doing that. He was worried that I, as a junior academic, just didn't understand the science-based nature of psychology. He was trying to help me because he didn't want to see me get into trouble. Paul, my dear boy. Sorry, he didn't speak like that. I'm using a bit of artistic license. Big apologies, Chris. I love you. I'm just doing this for effect, okay? Paul, my dear boy, I'm so sorry, but you're not allowed to do that. You see, students have to produce a piece of empirical research for their honours year. It has to be empirical. It can't be qualitative because it has to be scientific. I had to tell him that empirical means understanding based on observation and experience. And therefore, qualitative research was not only scientific in that sense, but it was also a pretty good way of doing science because it was a really good way of understanding how people experience the world. That senior academic looked a bit shocked, walked away, and we never spoke about it again. That airbrushing of qualitative research out of the history of psychology was largely undertaken because when psychology was working hard to establish itself as a legitimate science, which was really kicking off in the late 19th century and then picked up speed in the early 20th century, at that time, quantitative research was seen as very prestigious. Society was running high on the fumes of the First and Second Industrial Revolutions with the exploitation of coal and gas that was being used to fuel factories and the mass production of commodity goods. So all of that was going on. And there was a great thirst for new technologies, both to accelerate and to capitalize from the Industrial Revolutions. And we saw a plethora of new inventions coming out that were impacting how people lived, mostly making it easier, making life easier for people, such as the use of electricity the invention of the light bulb and the combustion engine, and so on. Medicine was also coming up with new ways of understanding and treating disease. And much of that disease was caused by a swell of the population in cities as people moved from working on the land to working in factories. And this led to public health problems with large numbers of people living in unsanitary, overcrowded conditions, which led to disease spread. So medicine was really the hero there, because it came in with medicines and vaccines, had a big impact, and gained a lot of prestige and power around that time. And many of those technological and medical innovations came from experiments conducted in laboratories. So by the early 1900s, the public were becoming more and more aware of that particular type of science, a lab-based science. And politicians and wealthy entrepreneurs, saw that type of science as an attractive area for investment. So they started moving more and more public and private money into those things. Money that was generated largely from the slave trade, but that's another story for another video. So running experiments in laboratories was viewed as proper science. It was valued, esteemed, and attracted lots of money, and psychology largely saw that as the area that it needed to move into to gain credibility and influence. So by the end, or by the middle of the 20th century, around the 1930s, 1940s, quantitative research had pretty much colonized the concept of science in psychology, to the point that qualitative research became viewed as unscientific, which it's not. And another thing happened. We saw the appropriation of the word experiment. It became the word that was used only to describe lab-based quantitative scientific methods in psychology. That lab-based quantitative method that became known as the experimental method was mostly about the manipulation of one or more variables in a controlled environment to see the impact of that manipulation on other variables of interest. And the aim of those methods was to find a causal relationship between variables. And experiment became the noun to describe that process of testing. It also got used both as a verb, to experiment, and as an adjective, experimental, as in experimental psychology, to describe that testing, where there were tests being run in a lab using quantitative methods. But here's the thing. That lab-based quantitative method, the experimental method, was all about following very precisely a number of systematic procedures and rules. And that's what's meant by a controlled environment. Those procedures and rules related to what could be observed, how it could be measured, how often it should be observed, and how the experimenter should behave. And then a whole set of rules and procedures related to how you analyze the data that comes from your observations. And breaking any of those rules could result in the work being rendered unscientific. But the word experimental is also about the process of breaking rules. That's how the word is commonly understood by the public, and certainly how it's understood in both the arts and cultural studies. So experimental art is about breaking rules, not about following rules. It's linked to the act of purposefully disrupting convention and normative practices. It's the breaking of the rules that opens up new ways of looking at things and thinking about things, and that leads to us forming new knowledge. And that's what qualitative research is all about, or at least it should be. The best qualitative research subverts rules. It doesn't follow rules. It's a process of discovery that means taking untrodden paths that haven't been trodden before, and testing. Well, here, it's not about checking for accuracy, but it's about challenging. It's like when you put yourself to the test, it's about challenging yourself. You're not testing yourself for accuracy. So in that sense of experimental and in the sense of testing, we could describe qualitative as very much experimental, as very much experimental psychology, because it's experimental in that sense of disrupting convention, disrupting received wisdom, to find a different way of thinking about a thing. And in the hands of critical psychologists like myself, perhaps that could lead to a radically different way of thinking about a thing. At least that's our aim. But, a big but here, I've been carrying a huge assumption through this video, which is that you are surprised that I'm describing qualitative methods as experimental methods. It's actually not surprising at all. And perhaps you wouldn't have been surprised about any of this, and perhaps you're not surprised by any of this, if or because you've not been fully socialized into psychology, into that quantitative lab-based science. That's because it's only really in that domain that the word experimental has been appropriated to only mean lab-based quantitative research. Outside of psychology and outside of the area of science that psychology has been working in, the word's meaning, that word experimental, or at least its dual meaning, is understood. People understand that people do experiments in laboratories, but that you can be experimental in a way that has nothing to do with laboratories and everything to do with what we know as qualitative research, which is breaking rules, subverting conventions, disrupting things in the quest for a new way of thinking about stuff. Okay, I'll end there. Gone on for a bit. Till next time. Ta-da.